September 16, 1581, the sun dipped below the horizon in Niers, Bavaria, as a hushed crowd gathered in the town square. All eyes were fixed on a stark wooden structure, a profane altar dominating the center, topped with a massive oak wheel. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, eager to witness what everyone knew would be extraordinary: the execution of the region's most feared man. Guards appeared, escorting a figure barely recognizable as human. Decades of unspeakable crimes had twisted Peter Niers into a dark legend, a specter haunting the German roads and forests. His face, etched with scars and a lifetime of cruelty, revealed only contempt for the onlookers. In moments, he would face one of humanity's most brutal execution methods. Broken on the wheel, every bone systematically shattered, then burned alive. But how does a man become such a monster, whose death demands such a horrific public spectacle? The answer lies on the bloody roads of 16th century Europe, where Peter Niers carved his name into history as one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. Peter Niers' story began in a childhood steeped in neglect and extreme poverty. Born around 1540 in Franconia, he grew up in an era ravaged by religious wars, famine, and plague. Orphaned young, he roamed as a beggar before discovering a far more sinister talent: murder. His initial crimes were born of desperation, attacking solitary travelers for a few coins and a crust of bread. Yet, this desperation quickly morphed into something far darker. Peter found he enjoyed killing. He didn't just tolerate the violence necessary for robbery, he relished it, prolonged it, refined it. For over 40 years, Niers terrorized the trade routes between Franconia and Bavaria, preying primarily on merchants, pilgrims, and travelers who had the misfortune of crossing his path. He was no mere bandit. He devised elaborate torture methods, keeping victims alive for days while subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. Period records describe Peter Niers as a man of average height but impressive strength, with soulless eyes and hands that constantly trembled, not from fear, but from a perverse excitement only violence could satisfy. He traveled with a small, equally depraved gang, but always led the attacks and decided the victims' fates. What made Peter Niers truly terrifying wasn't just the sheer number of his victims, estimated at over 500, but the ritualistic nature of his crimes. He developed a morbid obsession with cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims and keeping others as macabre trophies. Reports from the era mention he always carried a leather sack containing fingers, ears, and other human fragments. Even more disturbing was his fervent belief that consuming human flesh granted him supernatural powers. This led to a particular preference for children, whose hearts he devoured while still warm, convinced it would make him invincible. Survivors of his attacks reported seeing him whisper incantations during his cannibalistic rituals. Peter Niers' sinister reputation spread rapidly, used by parents to frighten disobedient children and prompting travelers to alter their routes. Increasingly large rewards were offered for his capture, but he always eluded authorities, as if protected by diabolical forces. Local authorities launched several expeditions to hunt him, but Peter knew every trail, every cave, every hiding place in the region's forests. He had transformed the territory into an extension of his own malice, establishing a network of informants among lesser criminals and desperate individuals whom he protected in exchange for loyalty. For decades, Peter remained a bloody shadow over the region. But even the most cunning monsters eventually make mistakes. Peter's mistake was underestimating the determination of one particular man, Georg Ammon, the magistrate of Niers, whose family Niers had brutally murdered years earlier. Ammon dedicated his life to capturing the serial killer, studying his patterns, mapping his movements, and infiltrating spies into his network. In August 1581, he finally cornered Peter Niers in an isolated forest cabin where the criminal had sought refuge after yet another massacre. The capture of Peter Niers sent shockwaves through the entire region. As news spread, crowds flocked to Niers to see the man who had become a legend of terror, chained in the city's prison. He continued to display disturbing behavior, laughing without reason and muttering incomprehensible words. Peter Niers's trial was more formality than legal proceeding. The evidence was overwhelming, with hundreds of witnesses, dozens of survivors, and his own macabre trophies found in his possession. But what truly sealed his fate was his confession. During interrogation, Peter not only admitted his crimes but described them in nauseating detail, seemingly proud of his work. He spoke of specific torture techniques, the taste of human flesh, and the rituals he believed gave him power. His accounts were so disturbing that some in the courtroom vomited. The sentence was announced with solemn pomp. Peter Niers would be executed by the wheel, but not an ordinary execution. Given the magnitude of his crimes, authorities decreed he would suffer an especially prolonged and brutal version. First, he would be tortured with red-hot pincers, then his bones would be systematically broken, and finally, he would be burned alive while still conscious. The execution was scheduled for September 16th, a date that became a local holiday celebrating justice. In the days leading up to the event, pilgrims and the curious traveled from distant cities to witness the end of the man who had terrorized the region for so long. On the morning of the execution, Peter Niers was brought to the center of Niers main square. The crowd was so vast that extra guards were needed to maintain order. Street vendors circulated, offering food and drink, transforming the event into a macabre popular fair. The execution equipment had been specially constructed, an oak wheel over 6 feet in diameter, mounted on a structure allowing it to be slowly turned. Beside it, braziers glowed with red-hot pincers and branding irons. A pile of kindling awaited the final act. Peter Niers was stripped and bound to the wheel with thick ropes. Even then, he showed neither fear nor repentance. His eyes remained empty, as if this terrible reality were just another nightmare he had inflicted upon hundreds of others. The torture began with red-hot pincers applied to specific points on his body, feet, hands, chest. With each application, skin sizzled, and the smell of burning flesh permeated the square. Peter screamed, but his scream seemed more of rage than pain, as if furious at his inability to escape. After an hour of torture with the heated irons, came the main part of the execution, the breaking of bones. The executioner, an experienced man specially hired for the occasion, began with the fingers and toes, carefully breaking each bone with a heavy hammer, producing a dry sound that the crowd heard in morbid silence. The breaking of larger bones was even more brutal. Peter's forearms were placed on the edge of the wheel and crushed with precise blows. The same happened to his legs, arms, and ribs. With each blow, he howled in pain, but his voice gradually weakened as shock and blood loss took their toll. The entire bone-breaking process lasted over 2 hours. When it was finished, Peter Niers was no longer recognizable as a human being. His body was a shapeless mass of flesh and shattered bones. But he was still alive, still conscious, still capable of feeling every second of agony. The final act was lighting the pyre beneath the wheel. Flames slowly licked at Peter's shattered feet, gradually climbing his mutilated body. Even then, facing the most horrible death imaginable, he did not ask for forgiveness, did not beg for mercy. His final moments were marked by the same cold hatred that had characterized his entire life. Peter Niers's execution lasted nearly 5 hours, from the beginning of torture until the flames finally consumed his body. When everything was over, his ashes were scattered to the wind, ensuring no trace of this evil remained. Peter Niers's death marked the end of an era of terror in the region. roads became safe again, families could travel without fear, and the name that had haunted an entire generation finally became merely a dark memory. But Peter Niers' story leaves us with disturbing questions about the nature of human evil. How can a man become a monster so completely devoid of humanity? What circumstances transform an orphaned child into a cannibalistic serial killer? And perhaps more importantly, what lessons can we draw from his story to prevent other Peters from arising in our world? The answer perhaps lies in the very brutality of the era in which he lived. In a society where violence was commonplace, where human life had little value, where orphaned children were abandoned to their fate, someone like Peter Niers was almost inevitable. He was a product of his time, an extreme manifestation of the darkness that dwells in the most shadowy corners of human nature. Today, more than 400 years later, Niers Square is a peaceful place where tourists buy souvenirs and families picnic. Few know that in that very location centuries ago, one of history's most malevolent men met his end on a torture wheel. But if we listen carefully to the wind that blows between the ancient buildings, we might still hear the echoes of that brutal execution that marked the end of a legend of terror. The story of Peter Niers, the criminal who was burned, mutilated, and crushed by the wheel, remains a dark reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, justice eventually prevails. Even if that justice comes in the most brutal and primitive form, it still represents the victory of civilization over barbarity, of light over darkness, of good over absolute evil.